What is force? What are some different kinds of forces? What is gravity? These are all valid questions. And these are all questions that we will be answering today. This is your daily life with Isaac Newton. So, let's start answering our questions. What is force? Well, simply speaking, force is a push or a pull on an object, resulting from an interaction on another object. Now, generally, forces fall into one of two categories. There is contact forces and non-contact forces, also known as action at a distance forces. The contact forces include normal force, applied force, tension force, spring force, friction force, and we'll get to that one later, and air resistance force. Now, the non-contact forces, or action at a distance forces, include gravitational force, electrical force, and finally, magnetic force. Let's move on. Let's look at some specific forces. We'll start with an easy one. Gravity. Gravity is the force that makes this apple fall to the ground. Gravity is an unseen force that keeps us firmly planted on the ground. It's what keeps us from floating away. In fact, let's just take a moment to thank gravity for keeping us firmly planted on this earth. That was fun. Moving on now, we come to friction. Friction is the force generated by a surface as an object slides across it. There's many places where this can come into play. For example, just walking. Now we're looking at net force. Net force is the total amount of force displayed in one single scenario. Force is measured in newtons. 1 newton is about the amount of force that this half-eaten apple exerts on my palm. Net force is usually displayed in what's known as a free body diagram. Let's look at an example. In this situation, the force of gravity upon this apple is 200 newtons, which is definitely incorrect, but for this scenario, we'll just say it's 200 newtons. Air resistance force is 50 newtons, pushing upwards. Since the force of gravity is much larger, we'll subtract that 50 newtons of air resistance force from gravity's 200 newtons, giving us a net force of 150 newtons. Now let's look at another classification of forces, balanced and unbalanced forces. An example of balanced forces can be expressed by this ball. This ball, resting on the table, has two forces acting on it. There's gravity pulling the ball down, and the table pushing back up. The table pushing up is an example of Isaac Newton's third law of motion and is spring force. But we'll get to the law of motion later. Okay, so because the two forces acting on the ball are equal and in opposite directions, they balance each other out. Now, what about an example of unbalanced forces? Take this ball. There's gravity pulling down on it, the table pushing back up. Now, what happens if I start to blow on it? Now there are three forces acting on it. There's gravity pulling it down, the table pushing back up, and then there's the air resistance force pushing it forward. So, now it's not completely balanced. That's an example of unbalanced force. Why don't we play some pool? Pool provides an excellent opportunity to learn about Newton's laws of motion. Newton's first law of motion states that an object at rest will stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force. And an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force. Newton's second law of motion states that force is equal to mass times acceleration. And finally, Newton's third law of motion states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Motion is simply movement. Speed is how fast an object is moving, and velocity is how fast the object is moving and the direction. Well, we certainly covered a lot of topics today. From what is force to what are the different kinds of forces, all the way to Isaac Newton's laws of motion. If there was anything you didn't quite get, I'd suggest rewatching the video. In the meantime, I'm off to buy more apples.